The desert stretched wide and unbroken beneath the sweltering sun. It was the land of the Apache, ancient and sacred, where the sky seemed endless, and the earth itself held memories older than time. For Cochise, chief of the Chiricahua Apache, the land was everything. It was where his ancestors had walked, where they had fought, and where they would one day rest. Yet today, as he stood atop a jagged ridge overlooking the valley below, he could feel the weight of inevitability pressing down upon him. The land was restless. His people, too, were restless. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the dry landscape. The Apaches had heard the stories of the U.S. soldiers, their relentless pursuit of the Apache way of life. The time for hiding, for running, was drawing to a close. The Apache had always fought, but now, more than ever, the fate of his people seemed uncertain. Cochise turned his gaze toward the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of orange and crimson, the setting sun casting a blood-red glow over the mountains. It was beautiful, yet it filled him with unease. The desert, the mountains, the very rocks and earth beneath his feet, they were alive, as they always had been. They whispered to him in ways that only the true leaders of his people could understand. The spirits of the land had spoken to him, urging him to listen. But what were they saying? Was it a warning? A rustle in the bushes behind him broke his reverie. He turned to see his trusted second-in-command, a tall, broad-shouldered warrior named Taza. Approaching, his expression was grim, his eyes filled with the burden of 1,000 thoughts. Taza had been with him through countless battles, through periods of peace and violence alike. They shared more than just leadership, they shared a bond, a connection that went beyond the material world. "The soldiers are near," Taza said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the knowledge he had just received. "They come by foot, by horse, and by wagon. They're not far behind." Cochise nodded, his face unreadable. The Apache were used to being pursued, to living on the edge of war, but this time felt different. It was not just the soldiers themselves, but the growing force that seemed to be behind them, a relentless will to erase all that the Apache were, to crush their culture, their beliefs, their way of life. "I know," Cochise replied, his voice low but firm. "We will not flee. We will not hide. We will fight." Taza nodded, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his weapon. He knew that Cochise was not just speaking of physical battle. The Apache had always been warriors, but they were also a people deeply connected to the land. It was that bond, that spirituality, which gave them strength. And it was that bond that had brought them to this moment, this final moment where they would face their enemies and determine the future of their people. "There are whispers among the warriors," Taza continued. "Some say it is time to leave the mountains, to move to a safer place, where we might live without constant fear of the soldiers." Cochise's eyes narrowed. He had heard those same whispers. He had always respected the voices of his people. But in his heart, he knew that leaving was not an option. The land would never allow it. The spirits of the ancestors, who had walked this earth before them, would never forgive such an abandonment. The Apache were meant to live here, to defend this land, not to run from it. "No," Cochise said again, more resolute this time. "We will stay, and we will fight, as our ancestors did." Taza remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Then, with a slight bow of his head, he spoke again. "There is another matter," he said. Cochise turned toward him, waiting. "A spirit visited me last night," Taza continued. His voice was careful, as if speaking of such matters required a certain respect. "It was an eagle. It circled above me, and then it spoke." Cochise's brow furrowed slightly. The eagle was a sacred animal to the Apache, a symbol of strength and vision. But spirits were fickle things, difficult to interpret, even for the most seasoned warriors. Still, Cochise trusted Taza's instincts. If the spirit had visited him, then it was important. "What did it say?" Cochise asked. It said, It said that the future of our people depends on a choice we have yet to make. It showed me a path, a cave hidden deep in the mountains. The eagle told me that we must go there, to find something that will change everything. Cochise's pulse quickened. The cave, the mountains, the visions of spirits and prophecies. The Apache believed that the land itself held power, that the spirits of their ancestors resided in the rocks and rivers, in the wind and the trees. There were many places in the mountains where the veil between the living and the dead was thin, where the past could be touched, and the future glimpsed. A choice, Cochise repeated. What kind of choice? Taza shook his head. The eagle did not say, only that the time is now. The soldiers are coming, and we must decide. For a long moment, Cochise stood still, staring into the vast desert before him. The wind picked up, stirring the dust at his feet. It was as if the earth itself was waiting, holding its breath for what was to come. The spirits, the ancestors, they were watching, and the weight of their gaze pressed heavily on his shoulders. The choice will be made, Cochise said quietly, his voice firm with the resolve of a man who had already lived through so many battles. But I will not act alone. We must consult with the elders, the warriors. We must decide together. Taza nodded, understanding the weight of Cochise's words. The tribe would need to come together, to unite their minds and spirits in the face of what was to come. There would be no room for hesitation, no time for second-guessing. The future of the Apache depended on this decision. We will gather them, Taza said. But we must move quickly. The soldiers are close. Cochise turned to him, his expression hardening. Then we will move quickly. Tonight. As the two men made their way back to the camp, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The distant mountains, once peaceful, now seemed ominous, casting long shadows over the valley. The spirits were restless, and the prophecy that had been set in motion was only just beginning to unfold. The moon rose high above the desert, casting its pale light on the jagged rocks and silent plains. The air was cool now, a rare blessing in the searing heat of the day. Cochise stood before the assembled warriors, his gaze steady and calm, though his mind raced with the weight of the decision that lay before them. The camp had gathered as the eagle's prophecy lingered in the hearts of the people. Cochise could feel the energy of the land, the earth beneath him humming with the presence of something ancient. The elders had spoken, their voices low and filled with reverence. They, too, had seen the signs, and they agreed with Cochise's course of action. The warriors, some young and eager, others old and weathered, waited in silence. Taza, standing by his side, gave a final look to the group before stepping forward. The crackling fire cast flickering shadows over his face, highlighting the scars earned in battles long past. We are the Apache, Taza began, his voice strong, yet tinged with an undercurrent of something unspoken. Our ancestors walked these lands, and they left their mark upon us. The eagle has spoken. We must follow its path, for the future of our people rests upon this journey. There was a murmur of agreement from the warriors. Some nodded solemnly. Others exchanged uncertain glances. The call to action had been given, and now it was up to them to follow it. Cochise's voice cut through the murmurs like a knife. We go to the cave tonight. We leave no one behind. The warriors' faces were serious now. Even the young ones, whose eyes were bright with the fire of youth, felt the weight of their leader's words. They knew that this was no ordinary journey. This was a test of their faith, their courage, and their connection to the very land that had nourished and protected them for generations. As the camp began to break apart, and the warriors prepared for the journey, Cochise called out to Taza. There is something more we must understand. My brother, he said, his voice low. Taza stepped closer, his brow furrowed in concern. What is it? Chief, the eagle spoke to you in a vision. Cochise began, his gaze fixed on the fire. But it also spoke to me. Taza's eyes widened. Though he said nothing, the spirits often spoke to the leaders, but rarely did they speak to more than one. I saw it, too, Cochise continued. The eagle. It led me to the same cave. But what I did not understand, what I could not understand, was the darkness that lingered there. The land is alive, yes, but there is something else hidden beneath it, something ancient. The spirits warn me of it. Taza was silent for a moment, contemplating the weight of Cochise's words. The earth, the land, was sacred to the Apache, but it was also filled with mysteries, mysteries that few truly understood. To the Apache, the land was not just a place to live, it was a living entity, a spiritual being that could offer blessings or curses. If there was darkness beneath the earth, then it was a threat to their very existence. We must be cautious, Taza said finally, his voice grim. The spirits do not warn for nothing. Cochise nodded, his expression somber. We will be cautious, but we must not turn away. We have no choice. With that, the two leaders turned to the warriors. Their journey would take them deep into the mountains, where the land grew wild and untamed. It was a place few had ventured, and even fewer had returned from. But the prophecy called to them, and they would answer it, for the future of the Apache rested upon their shoulders. The group moved swiftly, leaving the camp behind as the stars began to light the night sky. The desert was quiet, the only sound the soft crunch of boots on the rocky ground. The warriors were accustomed to traveling under the cover of darkness, their senses honed to detect the slightest movement, the faintest sound. Yet tonight, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, thick with an unspoken tension. Even the wind, usually a comforting presence in the desert, now felt as though it carried the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. Kinya, a young warrior who had not yet earned his place among the most seasoned of the Apache, walked silently near the back of the group. He had heard the stories, of course, the legends of spirits that roamed the mountains, the ancient forces that stirred beneath the earth. But he had always dismissed them as superstition. Now, with the prophecy hanging in the air, he was not so sure. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Kinya's mind raced. He had never been this far from the safety of the camp, and the journey felt strange, almost surreal. The wind seemed to whisper to him, and the rocks, jagged and ancient, seemed to watch him with a quiet knowing. For the first time, he felt as if he was walking on the edge of something greater than himself. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden rustling in the brush ahead. The warriors tensed, instinctively reaching for their weapons. But it was only a fox, its glowing eyes flashing in the darkness as it scurried across the path and disappeared into the shadows. Do not fear the animals, Cochise said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the still night air. They are guides, sent by the spirits. Kinya nodded, though he still felt uneasy. The land itself seemed alive tonight, as if it were breathing, waiting for something to happen. The further they went, the more intense the feeling became. Finally, they arrived at the cave. It was nestled deep within a craggy mountain pass, hidden from view by the sharp cliffs that surrounded it. The entrance was small, barely large enough for a man to enter. Yet, as the warriors stood before it, the air seemed to shimmer with a strange energy, as if the very earth was humming with power. Cochise stepped forward first, his hand resting lightly on the rock as if greeting an old friend. He paused for a moment, eyes closed, listening. There was a faint pulse beneath the earth, a rhythm that he could feel in his bones. It was the heartbeat of the land, the heartbeat of their ancestors. It is here, he said softly. The spirit of the land awaits us. The warriors, one by one, entered the cave, following their leader into the darkness. Kinya was the last to step inside, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The air inside the cave was cool, and the walls seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. It was as though the cave itself was alive, breathing in time with the warrior's steps. They moved deeper into the cave, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. As they reached the center, a strange glow began to emerge from the walls, illuminating the space with an ethereal light. The glow seemed to come from the very stones themselves, as if the earth was speaking to them. And then, at the heart of the cave, they saw it. A stone blade, ancient and intricately carved, rested upon a pedestal of rock. It glowed with an otherworldly light, its surface covered in strange symbols that none of the Apache had ever seen before. The blade seemed to hum with power, as if it were alive, waiting for someone to claim it. Kinya stepped forward, his hand reaching out toward the weapon. As his fingers brushed the stone, a surge of energy shot through him, and he staggered back, his heart racing. Visions flooded his mind, visions of fire, of war, of an ancient battle that had taken place long before he was born. He saw the land itself tearing apart, as though the earth itself was waging war against those who sought to destroy it. The blade was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of something greater, something powerful, something dangerous. Kinya's vision blurred, and he heard the eagle's call once more, distant but clear. The spirits were warning him. They were warning them all. Cochise stepped forward and placed his hand upon the blade, his face unreadable. "This is it," he said softly. "The weapon we have sought. But we must be careful. The power it holds is not of this world." Taza's voice broke the silence. "We must take it. The soldiers are closing in. This may be our only chance." Cochise nodded, his expression hardening. "We take it, but we do not use it lightly. The land has given us a gift, but it is also a test. We must decide how to wield it." As they gathered around the stone blade, the land itself seemed to watch them. The winds outside picked up, and a distant rumble of thunder echoed through the cave. The spirits were restless, and their judgment had begun. The stone blade sat upon the pedestal, its surface shimmering with an eerie, almost hypnotic glow. The cave was silent, save for the soft echo of their breaths. The warriors stood in a loose circle around it, eyes wide with both awe and fear. Kinya's hand still tingled from the brief contact with the blade, and his heart beat erratically in his chest. His body was alive with the energy that the weapon seemed to pulse with, and yet there was an undeniable feeling of foreboding. He glanced at Cochise, whose expression remained impassive, his eyes dark and unreadable as he studied the blade. The chief's face was carved from stone, his every movement deliberate, as if he were communing with the land itself, sensing something others could not. Taza, ever the practical one, spoke first, his voice low and cautious. "We cannot leave this behind. The soldiers are close, and we are running out of time. This weapon, whatever power it holds, may be the only thing that can save us." Cochise nodded but did not speak immediately. He reached out with a steady hand, and the warriors instinctively held their breath. His fingers hovered just above the blade's surface, as if waiting for some kind of sign from the land itself. The glow seemed to intensify at his touch, pulsing rhythmically, almost as if it were alive, aware of the power that it represented. Finally, Cochise's hand made contact with the blade, and a sudden rush of energy flooded through him. His eyes widened for a moment, but his face remained impassive. He withdrew his hand quickly, as if he had been burned, and looked at the blade again, his brow furrowed in thought. Taza stepped forward, his expression troubled. "What is it, Chief?" Cochise stood still for a moment, his eyes focused on the blade, as if listening to something only he could hear. He had felt something, a whisper from the spirits, perhaps, or a warning. Whatever it was powerful. "It is as I feared," Cochise said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "This blade is not just a weapon. It is something much more, something ancient. It holds the power to control the land itself." Kinya, who had been standing quietly at the back, stepped forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean, Chief?" he asked. "Is it a weapon of war, or something else?" Cochise turned toward him, his gaze sharp and piercing. This blade is older than any of us. It is a part of the land, just as we are. The spirits do not give such gifts lightly. This weapon, if used recklessly, could destroy not just our enemies, but the land itself. Kinya felt a shiver run down his spine. The idea of such power, the ability to control the land itself, was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. He had always believed that the Apache were the protectors of the land, the guardians of its ancient wisdom. But now, with the blade before them, he wondered if the balance between man and nature could be upset. Taza, ever the pragmatist, was quick to speak. But the soldiers are coming. Chief, we cannot afford to hesitate. We need this power if we are to survive. Cochise looked at Taza, his gaze unwavering. I know, he said quietly, but we must be careful. The land has given us this weapon for a reason. We must understand it before we wield it. The spirits have entrusted us with this responsibility. We cannot allow our fear to cloud our judgment. The cave seemed to grow colder in that moment, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The warriors exchanged uneasy glances, their instincts telling them that something was about to unfold that none of them could truly prepare for. The blade hummed softly, its glow dimming and flickering, like a dying ember struggling to stay alight. Kinya, still reeling from the strange surge of energy he had felt earlier, approached the blade cautiously. His hand, almost of its own volition, reached out again, this time to touch the hilt of the weapon. As his fingers made contact, a wave of heat coursed through his body, much more intense than before. His vision blurred, and for a moment, the world around him seemed to dissolve into nothingness. In an instant, he was standing in a vast, desolate landscape. The sky was dark, a storm swirling in the distance. The earth beneath his feet cracked and split open, revealing a fiery chasm that stretched as far as the eye could see. Kinya could feel the heat from the chasm, the pull of the earth's raw energy. But it was not a comforting warmth, it was a force, an unrelenting, destructive power. And then he saw them, figures, cloaked in shadow, stood on the edge of the chasm. They were the spirits of the land, ancient, forgotten beings who had once walked the earth. Their faces were twisted with sorrow and rage, and they pointed toward him, their hands raised in accusation. A voice, deep and thunderous, echoed in his mind, speaking a language he could not understand. The words were heavy with foreboding. The land is angry, the voice said. The balance has been broken. You who wield the blade must choose. Restore the land or destroy it. The vision shattered like glass, and Kinya was back in the cave, his hands still clutching the blade. His heart raced, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The room swirled around him, and he felt as though he might collapse. Are you all right? Taza asked, his voice filled with concern as he reached for Kinya's arm to steady him. Kinya shook his head, his mind still reeling from the vision. The land, the spirits, they spoke to me, he said, his voice trembling. They say the balance is broken. We must choose. Save the land, or destroy it. Cochise stepped forward, his eyes dark with understanding. He had felt it too, the warning, the weight of responsibility that the weapon carried. He could see the fear in Kinya's eyes, and yet, he knew that the young warrior was beginning to understand something far deeper than any of them had anticipated. The land has always spoken to us, Cochise said, his voice steady but laced with the gravity of the situation. But this power is different. It is not just the land that is speaking, it is the spirits, the ancient ones, who have seen what we cannot. They are warning us of a great danger. Taza clenched his fists, frustration evident in his voice. Then what are we to do? Wait for the soldiers to come and destroy us? We need this power now, before it is too late. Cochise remained calm, his gaze never leaving Kinya. We must understand the weapon first. We must learn what it truly is before we use it. The spirits are watching us, and we cannot afford to make a mistake. Kinya stood silent, his mind wrestling with the implications of what he had seen. The blade was a weapon, yes, but it was more than that. It was a part of the land, a symbol of the balance that the Apache had always fought to protect. If they used it recklessly, they risked destroying everything they held dear. The silence in the cave stretched on, heavy and oppressive. The weight of their choices pressed down on each of them. The future of the Apache people hanging in the balance. And in the stillness, the hum of the blade seemed to grow louder, its call echoing in the hearts of all who stood before it. Finally, Cochise spoke, his voice resolute. "We will use the blade, but we will do so with the wisdom of our ancestors. We will seek the guidance of the spirits, and we will honor the land that has given us this gift. Only then will we know how to wield its power." Taza nodded reluctantly, though his eyes still burned with the urgency of the situation. "We have no time to waste. Chief, the soldiers are closing in, and we must act before they take everything from us." Cochise turned to the warriors. "Prepare yourselves," he said. "The battle is coming, and with it, the choices we make will determine the future of the Apache." As the warriors gathered their belongings and made ready for the journey ahead, Kinya stood in the center of the cave, his hand still resting on the blade. He had seen the warning in the spirit's eyes, felt the weight of their judgment. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: the Apache would no longer fight only for survival. They would fight for the land, for the spirits, and for the balance that had always sustained them. The blade had chosen them. Now, they would decide how to use it. The night was alive with the whispers of the wind and the distant calls of unseen creatures. The Apache had left the cave, their minds heavy with the weight of the decision they had made. The blade was now in their possession, but it was more than just a weapon. It was a key to the unknown, a force that could tip the balance of power in ways they could neither fully comprehend nor control. As Cochise led his warriors back toward their camp, the weight of responsibility pressed on him more heavily than ever before. The soldiers were getting closer, and time was running out. The Apache people had always lived in the shadows of the U.S. Army, fighting for their way of life, their land, and their freedom. But now, with the blade at their side, the stakes had changed. The land itself had chosen them to act. But at what cost? Cochise stood at the edge of a cliff, looking down at the valley below. The moonlight shimmered on the river that wound its way through the desert, a silver thread through the dark fabric of the night. In the distance, the faint sound of drums reached his ears, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to match the beat of his own heart. "We are close," Taza said, his voice breaking the silence. He stood beside Cochise, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The soldiers are not far off. We must act." Cochise nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The eagle's prophecy echoed in his thoughts. Restore the land or destroy it. Those words had haunted him ever since Kinya had shared his vision in the cave. The weight of the blade in their hands felt heavier with each passing hour. If the Apache chose wrongly, the land itself could be lost to them, its spirit crushed under the weight of their mistakes. He turned to face his warriors. They were gathered in a loose circle around him, their faces shadowed by the flickering firelight. Each one wore the same expression, determined, but uncertain. They were prepared for battle, but none of them knew what kind of battle it would be. The soldiers would come with their guns and their numbers, but the Apache had always fought with something more, something that could not be measured by weapons or strength alone. "We will fight," Cochise said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fire. "But not just with steel and blood. We fight with the land, with the spirits that guide us. We will strike from the shadows, as we always have, and we will not stop until we are certain of the blade's purpose." Taza's eyes narrowed, sensing the weight behind Cochise's words. "And if the blade leads us to destruction, Chief, what then?" Cochise's gaze was unwavering. "Then we will face the consequences, as we always have, but we will not allow the soldiers to destroy our people." or our way of life, without first knowing the cost. The warriors gathered their weapons, preparing for the coming confrontation. They moved silently through the night, their steps barely making a sound as they navigated the harsh terrain. Kinya, despite the visions he had seen in the cave, felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He had touched the blade and seen the spirit's warning. But now, in the shadow of Cochise's leadership, he understood that the fight ahead would be unlike any they had fought before. As they neared the valley, the first signs of the approaching soldiers became clear. The distant glow of campfires flickered in the darkness, and the sound of marching feet reached their ears. The U.S. Army was closing in, their numbers large and their presence unmistakable. Cochise stopped suddenly, raising his hand to signal the warriors to halt. The group froze, their eyes scanning the valley below. The soldiers were encamped in a wide formation, their tents scattered across the land like a patchwork of cloth and canvas. The hum of military activity was evident, soldiers sharpening their weapons, lighting fires, and making preparations for the final push against the Apache. Taza stepped forward, his voice low. "There are too many. We cannot face them head-on." "We do not need to," Cochise replied, his eyes focused on the soldiers below. "We will strike from the shadows. We will become part of the land, as we always have. Let them come to us." The warriors nodded, understanding the plan. They would use the terrain to their advantage, moving swiftly and silently, attacking in small, coordinated groups, and retreating before the soldiers could retaliate. They were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their identity, their culture, and their future. The Apache had always been a people of the land, and it was from the land they would draw their strength. But as Cochise stood there, watching the soldiers below, a troubling thought gnawed at the back of his mind. The vision Kinya had seen in the cave, the warning of the spirits, still haunted him. Restore the land or destroy it. The soldiers were not just a physical enemy. They were the manifestation of a greater force, one that sought to erase everything the Apache were. The fight before them would not just be a battle for land. It would be a battle for the very soul of their people. Kinya, standing beside him, felt the weight of the chief's gaze. "We will fight with everything we have," Kinya said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. Cochise turned to him, his expression softening for a moment. "And we will win, Kinya. But we must also know when to stop, when to save the land. The blade will guide us, but only if we listen." Kinya nodded, his fingers lightly touching the hilt of the blade that hung at his side. He still didn't fully understand the weapon's purpose, but he knew one thing: the spirits had chosen them, and they would not fail. The battle began with the dawn, as the first rays of sunlight crept over the hills and bathed the valley in golden light. The Apache moved swiftly, their forms blending into the shadows of the desert landscape. They attacked with precision, striking at the soldiers' supply lines, sabotaging their tents, and cutting down their patrols before they had a chance to react. The soldiers were caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the attack. The Apache, long known for their hit-and-run tactics, moved like ghosts, appearing and disappearing into the desert as if they were part of the land itself. The soldiers fired their rifles, but the bullets seemed to find only air, their aim lost in the chaos. The Apache struck quickly and then retreated into the hills, leaving the soldiers disoriented and scrambling to regroup. It was a tactic they had used for generations, swift, decisive, and merciless. But as the battle raged on, something began to change. The land itself seemed to stir, reacting to the bloodshed that was being spilled upon it. The wind shifted, growing colder, and the earth trembled beneath their feet. The Apache warriors could feel it in their bones. The blade was calling to them, urging them forward. Kinya, who had fought valiantly alongside his brothers, felt the surge of power once more. The blade pulsed with energy, and for the first time, he understood what it truly was. It was not just a weapon. It was a part of the land's spirit, a force that could restore balance or destroy everything in its path. He felt the spirits around him, guiding his every move. The earth was alive with their presence, and they were urging him to use the blade, to end the battle, to end the war. But Kinya hesitated. Restore the land or destroy it. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on his chest. Cochise, sensing his doubt, peered at his side, his face grim but filled with understanding. The land will speak to you, Kinya, but you must listen carefully. The blade is not for vengeance, it is for balance. You must choose when to strike and when to pull back. Kinya stood silent, his gaze fixed on the battlefield below. The soldiers were regrouping now, their numbers overwhelming. The Apache were strong, but they could not fight forever. The blade hummed at his side, urging him to act. The earth beneath him seemed to pulse with anticipation. The spirits waited. The choice was his. The battlefield lay in silence, the dust of the desert swirling in the wind like the spirits of the ancestors. The Apache had fought fiercely, their warriors moving with the grace and skill passed down through generations. But despite their courage and their speed, the numbers of the soldiers had begun to overwhelm them. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the valley, and the air was thick with the smell of blood and dust. Kinya stood at the edge of the cliff, his heart racing, his fingers still wrapped tightly around the hilt of the ancient blade. The ground beneath him hummed with energy, and the spirits of the land seemed to whisper in his ear. The vision he had seen in the cave, the prophecy of the blade's power, now felt like an undeniable truth. The time had come to make the final decision. The spirits were watching, and the land awaited his choice. Behind him, Cochise and the other warriors had fought with unmatched determination. They had used every tactic in their arsenal, striking from the shadows, disappearing into the hills, and attacking from unexpected angles. But now, the soldiers had regrouped, and the Apache had been pushed to the brink. The battle could not continue forever. They were too few, and the soldiers were too many. Kinya's eyes scanned the battlefield. The Apache had done their best to slow the soldiers, to prevent their progress. But the U.S. Army's firepower, their rifles and cannons, were overwhelming. He saw his brothers fall, warriors who had fought beside him for years. He saw the fear in their eyes as the soldiers advanced, their numbers vast and merciless. The Apache were not just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for the soul of their people, for the very land that had sustained them for centuries. And the blade at his side, glowing with an otherworldly power, seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The weapon was not just a tool, it was a force that could change everything. Kinya's thoughts raced. Restore the land or destroy it. The words echoed in his mind, the weight of their meaning pressing on his chest. The spirits had warned him, had shown him the consequences of both choices. If he wielded the blade recklessly, he could destroy not only the soldiers but the land itself. The Apache were the guardians of the land. They had always fought to protect it. If the blade's power was unleashed in rage or desperation, it would consume everything. The spirits had given them this gift. But it was not a gift to be taken lightly. But if he chose to hold back, if he chose to trust in the wisdom of the spirits, perhaps there was another way. Perhaps there was a way to end the bloodshed without destroying the land, to restore the balance. As the prophecy had said, Kinya's eyes turned toward Cochise, standing not far behind him, watching with a calm intensity. The chief's gaze was steady, filled with years of wisdom and the knowledge of countless battles fought. He had seen the rise and fall of nations, the shifting tides of power, and he understood the land in a way few others could. But even Cochise could not make this decision for Kinya. This was Kinya's choice, and his alone. Taza appeared at Kinya's side, his breath heavy, his face smeared with dirt and blood. He had been fighting fiercely, but even he knew that the Apache could not win this battle by force alone. "We cannot fight forever," Taza said, his voice rough. "The soldiers are too many. We must use the blade. Kinya, We must use its power now, before it is too late. Kinya turned to face his brother, his eyes filled with sorrow and resolve. The blade is not just a weapon, he said quietly. It is part of the land, part of the spirits who guide us. If I use it now, I may destroy everything we have fought for. Taz's face twisted in frustration. But what will happen if we don't use it? We will be wiped out. Kinya, the soldiers will erase us from this land, and all that we have fought for will be lost. Kinya looked out across the battlefield again. The soldiers were advancing. The Apache were retreating, their strength fading with every passing moment. He could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. If he used the blade, it would give the Apache a chance to survive. But at what cost? Could they survive at the cost of their identity? Their bond with the land? Would they be forever changed? And then, in the stillness of the desert air, he heard it, the faintest whisper, carried on the wind. Restore the balance. It was the voice of the spirits. Kinya closed his eyes, feeling the earth beneath him, the pulse of the land. The Apache were part of the land. The spirits had never left them. They were always watching, guiding them. This was not just a battle for survival. It was a battle for the soul of their people, for the future of their children. If they lost this fight, it would not just be a loss of land, but a loss of everything they were. Kinya knew, in that moment, what he had to do. He would not let the blade decide for him. The Apache had always been a people of wisdom, of balance. The land had given them the blade, but it was up to them to choose how to wield its power. With a deep breath, Kinya lifted the blade, the ancient weapon glowing brighter as he did. The air around him seemed to crackle with energy, the very earth humming in response to the blade's presence. His mind cleared, and he felt the presence of the spirits surrounding him, their voices guiding him, urging him to listen to the land. He raised the blade high, and for a moment, everything stopped. The wind ceased, the sounds of the battlefield grew quiet, and time itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, with a voice not his own, Kinya spoke. Land of my ancestors, hear me. We are your children. We do not seek to destroy, but to protect. We do not seek vengeance, but balance. If we must fight, let it be for the restoration of the land, not for our own pride. If we must sacrifice, let it be for the future, not for the past. The blade in his hand began to hum with power, its glow brighter than the sun itself. And then, the earth began to stir. The very ground beneath the soldiers' feet trembled. The sky darkened, and a wind unlike any other howled across the battlefield. The soldiers, unprepared for the fury of the land, staggered back in fear. The earth beneath them cracked open, the river that had flowed peacefully through the valley now swelling and surging, rushing toward them with a terrifying force. The Apache warriors, with their connection to the land, moved as one, retreating back into the hills as the soldiers were swallowed by the storm of nature's wrath. Kinya stood firm, the blade raised high, his heart filled with both fear and awe. The spirits had answered. The land had restored its balance, its power flowing through him. The soldiers were overwhelmed by the forces of nature, the floodwaters, the quaking earth, the winds that seemed to rise from the very depths of the desert. The battle was over. The soldiers were driven back, their numbers scattered, their resolve broken. The Apache had survived, but the cost had been great. The land had been saved, but it had been forever changed. And so had the Apache. Kinya lowered the blade, his heart heavy with the weight of what had been done. He had saved his people, but at what price? The blade had fulfilled its purpose, but it was not the answer to all things. The spirits had guided him, but now, it was up to the Apache to rebuild, not just their homes, but their relationship with the land, with the spirits, and with each other. Cochise stood beside him, his expression unreadable, but in his eyes, Kinya saw something else, something deeper. It was not just victory or defeat that mattered. It was the understanding that the Apache had not lost their way. They had protected what mattered most. The blade has done its part, Cochise said softly. Now, we do ours. Kinya nodded, his heart at peace for the first time in many days. The spirits had spoken. The land had been restored. The Apache would endure. But they would never forget the lesson learned. The balance of the land, once lost, could never be taken for granted again. In the years that followed, the Apache rebuilt their lives, their bonds with the land stronger than ever. The blade was hidden away, its power no longer needed. The Apache, though scarred by the battle, had found a new understanding of their place in the world. The spirits continued to guide them, as they always had, and Kinya, now a leader in his own right, knew that the true strength of his people lay not in weapons or force, but in their deep, unbreakable connection to the land and the wisdom of their ancestors. And so, the Apache survived, as they always had, guardians of the land, protectors of the balance, and children of the spirits.